Hello, friends, and everybody. Welcome back to Turtlecast. Super excited to have our special guest on today, Suzanne Simard, and I hope I got the last name right. She is the queen of the forest. She is the OG boreal wizard. I got to tell you, she came out with this book, Finding the Mother Tree, after a wonderful bit of life experience between her career and personal perspectives that led into this idea of symbiotic relationships between plants and other fungi and organisms within these forests, specifically in British Columbia. The data coming from the woods is something quite remarkable. You just have to figure out where to look and how to pay attention to it. And right now, I got to tell you, if you haven't picked up Finding the Mother Tree, it would behoove you to do so because there's much to be learned, not only about the nature of the forest, but the nature of us as human beings. So, Suzanne, thank you so much for coming on to
Yes,
Turtlecast.
thank you.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah, listen, I mean, delight's better than just like absolutely dreading talking to Jason and I, you know?
No way.
You got a lot of personal stories in here, Suzanne, and they're quite wonderful. And I'm glad you bridged the aspects of what was going on through your own personal journey and also the scientific sort of business aspects that were going on. And then also how you mirrored aspects of the forest in the way its, purpose was driven and how you actually brought that purpose into your own life and how that actually challenged many of the things you were doing in terms of your work for Weyerhaeuser and other companies to change the game in forestry. And what I found most remarkable about this, and the fact that it seems to be missed, is that most times in life, it's the things that are unseen that typically are the key drivers to the things that are seen. And I think about that in the sense of human thoughts. Nobody can see them, but they're driving everything else. They cause us to do these actions. And when you stood out in the forest, and I would love for you to speak about this, you see the trees and you see that some are flourishing, some are failing. Clear cutting does not work, free to grow, all this other stuff. It lacked the natural balance and biodiversity required for life. And so what you needed to do was you like, I got to go deeper. And in a very physical sense, you looked under the soil. And in that unseen world is where you found the answers to what was actually foundationally allowing life to flourish within the forests of British Columbia. So, would you mind just for the people that haven't read this, tell them a little bit about what that means?
Well, when you're walking in the forest and you see this incredible place, right? We all, I don't know, most of us feel really amazing and good in the forest. I mean, I think some people are afraid, but the more time you spend in the forest, the more you love it. And actually, what's going on below your feet is even more interesting. It's just we can't see it, and so we've not understood it, and and we've ignored it as well. And but nowadays, our scientific tools are developing at this rapid pace, and it's allowing us to put a microscope down in the soil. And that's basically what I did when I was looking at, as you said, these plantations that were growing up in clear cutting after taking away old growth forests and replacing them with these rows of pines. And what we found in looking below ground is that beautiful old growth forest, which is a highly connected place where trees are in constant conversation. I'll call it that. In science, we call them interactions.
Mm,
They're constantly in this back and forth conversation. They that is very sophisticated, and they do this through a number of ways. They communicate through the air. They also communicate through these fungal networks that run through the soil and actually link trees together. And when these old forests are cut down, that conversation is basically stopped. The fungal network that is like the internet below ground. It's you can think of it as a bunch of telephone wires even, but the internet through which information passes between trees. That when it's replaced with plantations, that internet suddenly it goes silent for a little while, and it kind of starts to rebuild a little bit with a few linkages, but not nearly the complexity. It would be like, you're broadcasting to over 200 countries. It
Right.
would be like, suddenly you're only broadcasting to one, and that's your own country.
That would be a
Once it's
shame.
replaced with this.
Yeah.
And yeah, so it completely simplifies the system. The diversity of those connections goes way down. And it takes decades, if not centuries, for these old forests to recover that sophisticated way of trees interacting together as a society. And really, they are a society because they are all linked together and they are all communicating and being very, attuned to each other, just as we are in our towns, our families, our countries.
So there's there's much diversity that happens there, and the forest is essentially speaking about this data very organically, and you're witnessing it as an observer. The forest, even though each of these organisms are have very distinct characteristics making them what they are, they understand that there's great benefit in the symbiotic relationship of them coming together for their own support, their own longevity, and their own evolution within these very, very old forests that have predated us as human beings, frankly. And when we look at that, I think there's much to be learned for society as a whole. And don't you think that we could actually find a bridge, maybe at least one pertinent example about understanding ourself and other selves and the great benefit and longevity we can find from something like that?
Yes, and I think that's why I called it Finding the Mother Tree, is because it really is a search, in ourselves and in our natural world, which is, us and all our relations, which include the trees and the fungi and the animals. Like, it's finding ourselves in that world. Like, what is our role? What is our place? And have we lost our way? Which I would say we have in many ways. And this is manifested in, huge global indicators, right? Those global indicators are, we have climate change.
Mm.
We have a mass extinction on our hand, the sixth one,
Yep.
that's caused by human beings. We have, like, people are migrating to get away from suffering. And we have the coronavirus. All these are indicators that we've gotten on the wrong path. And that wrong path is, I call it a wrong path because a lot of us, or at least the people that are making the big policy decisions, the practices, and ultimately they're doing it for us, the people. We've forgotten that we're just part of this big network of organisms that make up our biosphere. We've sort of got onto this thing that we're superior, that, that nature is for us to manipulate, for our own benefits. And that is, for example, cutting down our trees, clear cutting our forests. And by the way, where I live in British Columbia, we only have 3% of our old growth forests left,
Wow.
of our iconic old growth forests. It means we've clear cut 97% of them, right? So this is a travesty. And so it's not a trivial thing at all. And so what I'm hoping in the book is that, as people read the book and read the stories, and that they absorb the science, even as they're reading the stories and enjoying the stories, that they go, you know what, like, there's a message here, that this connection of, up among ourselves, among trees, ourselves with trees, like, we are all linked together. We have these relationships that should be built on respect, reciprocity, carrying out our responsibilities. That we need to come back to this and create these, healthy linkages back to our environment, and that also transfers over to how we behave in our own human societies too. It's basically, these relationships are ubiquitous, no matter whether you're a human being or a squirrel or a tree, or, they it
I'm a pretty
relationships
tall
are what
squirrel.
we are. What's
I'm a
that?
pretty tall squirrel then.
Yeah.
Yeah. Y Listen, Suzanne, you made this point about nature, and we were cutting it down, and we're almost isolating ourselves from it. But it's this ridiculous human paradox that we've created because we are, in fact, nature. So as we go and we
Mhm.
clear cut these things where it's almost like you're clear cutting your own feet off. If it I understand that trees help scrub the air. It's a function of the things that, afford us oxygen, much like phytoplankton in the water. So every time you cut one down, remember that takes oxygen away from something that needs it. That may be a human or another animal or something else for that point. And understanding the simplicity of that, but when brought together, looks complex. But the idea is fundamental in the fact that these forests help us survive and we are one in the same with that nature. And I think that's a lesson that we all need to continue to learn when it comes to, taking a walk in the woods and understanding one another regardless of where we are. Because a tree scrubbing oxygen, in Canada, who knows where that oxygen molecule goes? It may go over to somebody in Australia. But what is like, is oxygen just isolated? No, the whole thing is completely interconnected, right?
Mhm.
And there's so much genius to the design of how these things have evolved over time. And like you say, we have to look to that wisdom. And when I think of the word wisdom, first you have knowledge, right? And then you got experience. If you keep them separate, nothing really is going on there. But when you bring them together, now you're wise because now I'm acting upon truthful information that's very objective and in front of me. And then these wise decisions are beneficial not only for the forests, but for us as human beings. And as we begin to respect nature, we begin to respect ourselves. But because we have this sort of mental disconnect, I think it's what's driven us so far away and into this sort of corner of climate instability, right? And through these wars and all the other things that are currently happening with humans that, we are the progenitor of. Am I off base with that?
No, you are absolutely right on. You know, you're absolutely right. Like the forest. So the forest, I'm just give you a few stats to bolster what you're
I love
saying. Like
stats.
the forests cover like one third of our terrestrial ecosystems, right? One third of our land base is covered in forests. And yet forests, um, you're right, they generate oxygen for us to breathe. Without the forest doing that through photosynthesis, they basically take CO2 out of the atmosphere, take water from the soil, combine them through this amazing process called photosynthesis, and it generates oxygen
Right.
and carbohydrates that are then basically run, make a tree grow and drive all of our biogeochemical cycles. So that means the oxygen cycle, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the water cycles all depend on these forests. So, worldwide, or, in Canada, 80% of our clean water comes from forests, right?
Wow.
85% of the global carbon storage in terrestrial ecosystems is in forests. 80% of our creatures in the world live in forests.
Hmm.
So even though they're only like one third of our land base, they are responsible. They're basically our life support systems. And you're right. Like, what are we doing? Like, we're clear cutting these forests as fast as we possibly can, especially the old growth forests, because we think, we've basically simplified our connection to nature through the dollar, right? Through our
Oh,
economic system,
here
we're
we
saying,
go. Tell me how you really feel.
yeah. So, like, are our lives worth that $2 we got for that two by
Here
four?
we go.
I don't think so.
Nope.
I think my kids' lives are priceless, and all the children's lives in the world and all the coming generations. It's not worth it's not worth cutting down all our forests for profits right now. And I don't mean profits that go to people. These profits are stuffed in the pockets of corporate CEOs for the most part.
Right.
They're like headless horsemen, and they don't bear a responsibility. They have no obligation to the land. They feel no obligation to the people. And so we're like pawns basically. And our lives depend on it. And so yeah, don't get me started.
No, I love getting you
No, no,
started.
yeah, I want to get into Susan. Suzanne, I'm from Washington State, and it was just a common occurrence to see clear cutting. So I kind of want to get a little micro with you because you talk about this with your family. What is kind of the old system, and why is it so brutal to the environment in the way that they're logging, especially with clear cutting?
Yeah, so the old system. So I grew up in a horse logging family,
Yeah.
right? And I know what it's like to cut down a tree. I've cut down trees, but my great grandfather, my grandfather, my dad, my uncles, they only took a couple of trees out of those forests a week, or maybe a couple of days sometimes. And my grandpa would go up into the forest and he would make a map, and he would say, here's all the trees, and we're going to take this one, and that's it. And so that's called selective harvesting. And selective harvesting has to be done carefully. You have to know your local forest to know which trees to take out, which trees to leave, so that it's a regenerative practice, meaning that the trees are going to grow back, without trouble. Whereas clear cutting, you basically take all the trees, like everything, because it's cheap to do that, and it brings huge profits. And what they're really after are those great big old trees, which I call mother trees, which
Mm.
we can get into. But they're the most valuable trees in the forest ecologically, but they're also what we prize for their economic value. And so, and when you clear cut and take out all these trees, what happens? Well, all kinds of things happen. One, biodiversity goes way down.
Yeah.
Of the plants, the fungi, the trees, everything. We've measured it.
Yeah.
We know, we've got the numbers. Also, we lose at least half the carbon right off the bat.
Wow.
Okay, so that carbon, the trees, goes into products. And some of those products are toilet paper, some of them are paper, some of them are cardboard, some of them are packaging, and a little tiny amount goes into a long-term storage. But 65% estimates are immediately, we assume, evaporates into thin air immediately on harvest. And so if you've got 1,000 tons of carbon in a hectare, as soon as you clear cut it, 500 of it has gone up in the atmosphere almost right away. And then the rest of the ecosystem slowly decomposes some of that carbon in the forest floor. And also, what also happens? The water table comes up because the trees aren't there anymore, and because they're not transpiring water out their crowns. And so we raise the water table, warm the soil, decomposition speeds up. If it's on a steep slope, that whole soil can
Right on.
slough down the slope, and then you're back at primary succession. It's not the same thing as a wildfire or a partial cut. It's way more severe, and it's the most draconian thing that we could do, but we do it for money.
You know, let's talk about that money. So this is actually kind of serendipitous. Some years ago, I wrote a paper on essentially base fundamental resources for economies. And even if you look at just money in general as energy, there's one thing I looked at, and that was called the Faustman formula. You know what that is?
Yeah, I do. Yeah,
So,
it's been a long time since I thought about
yeah,
it, but yes.
German forester Martin Faustman, 1849. And what they were trying to figure out is if I have a specific amount of land and there's a specific amount of trees in it, what is the optimal time for me to cut down whatever amount of trees within that land? And then on top of that, you could also invert that ratio to say, well, how many trees can be supported by the soil itself? Because, from an economic thought, you're like, okay, I have all this space. These trees are pretty spaced out. Let's just put these things in rows and put as many as we can as possible. And then from that means we'll have a higher yield, but you're actually crushing the nutrient level. It goes down because it can't support essentially the amount of credit that's been instilled into that system, which I would say more lumber, right? So here's what I'm curious about. And you wrote this was earlier in the book, page 43. You made a comment. You said, I blurted, you know, the way they sometimes leave the big seed trees in Germany. Martin Faustman understood something in 1849. The Germans were figuring something out. What is it? Because you actually didn't go into it, and I feel like it was just glazed over, but it's really
Mhm,
fundamentally important because Germany is not as big as the US or British Columbia, but they still
mhm,
have plenty of trees. What
mhm.
did they figure out that we were over here on the, western part of the world just completely ignoring?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a deep. There's a lot of depth to the answer in that. So, yeah, European forestry was well established over thousands of years, and families like German families would have they would actually own or the royalty would have jurisdiction over whole valleys, but Germany is I actually haven't been to Germany myself, but I understand it as a diverse place with lots of valleys, and each valley is unique. The forest is unique, and people that were had ownership or management practices over that valley. And usually, they're family owned valleys. They would figure out what worked in that valley, right? They'd try things, and they say, well, their soils are like this and the trees are like this, and aspect we're going to try maybe this partial cutting or selection or seed trees. and it worked, right? They go back and say, well, that worked, and I mean, we can adjust things a little here, and so they develop their practices over experience and knowledge, like you said, and ultimately their wisdom. And whereas and so those German practices were well honed, and that what we call silviculture systems in forestry, the seed tree method, partial retention methods, shelter wood methods,
Mm.
selection methods, those were developed from that very fine tuning. And when Europeans colonized North America, they didn't understand the land, right? The land was understood by the Aboriginal people who had lived here for 10,000 or more thousand years, who were practicing, you know, land management or land stewardship, like kind of like the Germans were doing here already for thousands of years. They understood, you know, when the salmon berries bloomed, and when the salmon ran, and when the cedar bark was fresh for harvesting the bark, cultivating which trees were going to become the totems or the canoes. There was a lot of care taken up. But when Europeans came to North America and colonized, we just started moving basically across North America from the East Coast to the West Coast, cutting the forests, to develop our society, ignoring the Aboriginal wisdom, or ridiculing it, ultimately, then, slowly it was like a settlement. But then in by the 1900s, the mid 1900s, it was not very regulated. But then suddenly, not suddenly, but slowly, over a few decades, there was a realization that these forests were extremely valuable, and the commercial interests got sold off to big companies. In Canada, we basically let out licenses to harvest our forests, and it became like this economic commodity. So the forest became a commodity. And it was more from settlement to and getting rid of our fear of forests to, oh, it's a commodity. And then in order to exploit that commodity, we did adopt German forestry practices, carte blanche, basically. But then, even some of those German forestry practices, the partial cutting, the variety that was available to us, slowly converged into, well, the most economically expedient way. And the biggest profit is going to come from clear cutting. And so it doesn't matter if you're in Northern California, or if you're in Alaska, or if you're in British Columbia. If you look on Google Maps, it doesn't matter what kind of forest you're in, it's clear cutting. It's not based on the nuances of that valley, the peculiarities of that soil, the aspect that's over here when the salmonberry blooms. It's not based on that kind of knowledge or wisdom, as you would say. It's just based on the dollar. How much can we make? And Faustman's formula, by the way, I mean, it was based on wood production. Now we know, that actually, now that we've exploited the forest so thoroughly, and our life support systems are on the verge of collapse, basically, now we say, oh, you know what? Maybe the forest isn't just valuable for its 2x4s, that there's other values. And we have not incorporated that into Faustman's formula at all. And if we were to, and say, actually, we want to keep our forests in the ground to store carbon, which is suddenly becoming priceless, suddenly that formula, needs to be totally rejigged. And the timing of cutting those forests, it might never make sense, or it's going to be a lot longer in the future than the 80 years or 100 years that formula would tell you.
We need the Simard model, I think. Somebody's got to write a Wikipedia page immediately, and I think you can rework that, no problem. All that statistical experience you got when you were working with Ted and everybody else, that's I think that's funnily interesting. You used a keyword here, and I would like you to define it for us. Stewardship. What does stewardship mean to you? It meant something to
Yeah,
the
that's
original Germans cutting down their trees and having their land. But when something becomes commercial and it leaves personal responsibility and turns into sort of a corporate responsibility, stewardship changes. It becomes a little bit more flexible. How would you define stewardship?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And maybe we can so there's if we can look at a continuum of what we do, right? So at the worst, it's we exploit.
Mhm.
That's not stewardship. That's just mining the forest. It's basically taking what nature gave us and making profits from it.
Okay.
Um, then we could move from, and this is basically how forestry developed across North America. We went in a period of exploitation. And then as we started to realize that, actually these resources aren't infinite, there's a limit here, then we kind of went into this regulation period. We're going to start regulating the forest and maybe even planting it. That I call kind of the early signs of management, right? Where we're actually in there actively interacting with the forest and trying to regulate what we do. And then, but that wasn't good enough because, in Canada, that management period or regulation period actually resulted in a dramatic increase in our cut, right? So it
Mm.
wasn't really management; it was still management to make money. And then we started getting, people started going, hey, I don't really like that those forests around me are all getting cut down. And so then we sort of went into this period in the US anyway, in the 1980s and 90s, into a period of like, well, maybe we should include some science here. Let's think about how these forests are responding to what we're doing. And and actually we understand that old trees are important. We understand coarse woody debris is important. Soils are essential. And so we went into this sort of period of science-based management. We're still not at stewardship yet, right?
Yeah.
Stewardship is actually taking our responsibilities seriously. And I mean, I don't mean responsibilities to the corporate heads or to the bank or even to creating, gross domestic product. I'm talking about our responsibility and obligations to the land,
Oh yeah.
right? Take it seriously. That's where you actually know and care about these other creatures. And you're actually in there like you're looking after your own families, right? Because you are essentially. You're looking after your family, your grandchildren, your great grandchildren, the 7 generations coming forward as the Indigenous people look at their worldview is based on what is seven going to look like in 7 generations. And if it's not going to look good, which, I look across that 7 generations, that'll be like in 2100, we're expecting our global temperatures to go up by 5 degrees. It's like unlivable.
Can't have that.
So stewardship is actually taking our obligations to being creatures on this earth, to look after our biosphere and each other and our land and our resources, taking it seriously and paying attention to the variability in the environment, taking care. If it's not time to harvest that forest, we're not going to do it, right? Instead of just plowing in there and taking it all no matter what.
Right.
We've done it with the salmon, we've done it with the cod, we've done it with the forests. And it's time to step back and actually be true stewards of these resources, to really care for them. So that's stewardship to me.
Could you tattoo everything you just said like on my neck and like my chest? And I don't have the most beautiful body, but I'll walk around shirtless to talk like that all day long. That was fantastic. Yeah. But because of that, you've put together this tomb of truth, as I would call it. Have they listened? And you know who I'm talking about with they. I don't need to name names. Have they
Yeah.
listened?
Not really, like not in a meaningful way.
Okay.
And when I say meaningful, what I call for in the book is to just what we talked about, being good stewards of the land.
Right.
And that is like, if we're going to continue to harvest trees and use trees, we always have, since the beginning of humans, because we've lived in forests and we use forests. We need this place to survive. We need food, shelter, and all the basic needs of humans. So we're going to continue to do that. But in order to do it properly, as we say, we need to be wise about it. And so far, governments have not been wise, and they haven't even taken the knowledge to get to wise yet. Like
Right.
I love the way you defined wisdom, um, and and so there's still in this economic model. Let's make as much money as we possibly can. We're going to call it in the name of jobs, even while our in the last 5 years where I live in British Columbia, due to mechanization, even as we're exploiting the forest faster and faster, taking more and more, the jobs have been cut by 40%,
Mm.
right? So yeah, so we need to move away from that exploitive thing. And I can't remember what the other part of your question was, but
No, it's just
maybe you could repeat me. Help
yeah.
me.
All I'd really asked was, have they listened? Are they
And yeah,
actually
so
taking the
right.
appropriate
So no, they
action?
haven't. They haven't. So here we are. I'm at home. I grew up in a province of old growth
Yeah.
forest, right? I was born in 1960. I was surrounded by iconic old growth forests, beautiful forests. I live now in a sea of clear cuts. And those iconic old growth forests, those big tall cedars, the red, we don't have redwoods, but imagine the redwoods, the big Sitka spruces on the coast, the big Doug firs in the inland rainforests, you know, they're almost gone. We've only got 3% of them left. And even on Vancouver Island right now, you might have heard that there's huge protests going on. There's blockades to protect the last watershed on Vancouver Island from clear cutting. Like, can you imagine, like, how could we be so short-sighted? So if they had paid attention to what I was talking about being careful and sensitive and being stewards and, and leaving the old trees, we wouldn't be doing that. So yeah, no, they haven't. The big indicators are no, they haven't listened.
Suzanne, we have a lot of millennials listen to our podcast, and it's a technology podcast, so we have scientists and stuff like that listen. What if you have a young scientist, just as you were, and you got all this data and you found this truth, and then you presented it, and it was just extremely frustrating to go through that? If, with your wisdom, if somebody's going through that right now, getting ridiculed, or they've come up with something like that, what would you give to them? Somebody,
Yeah,
or what would you give to your younger self in that situation?
that is such a great question. And I would say keep your power and speak your truth. And don't let the bastards get you down.
Love it.
I love
As
it.
my stepfather
I'm
said.
sending you a T-shirt with that on it.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so how do you do that? Like, if you feel alone, like I definitely felt alone in the wilderness myself. I had friends. I did have people supporting me, and it wasn't enough to make the big difference like I would have liked before we're only down to our last 3%. But it's absolutely essential that you have this support network. So you've got your truth, you've got your idea, you're feeling silenced, you gather your group, right? And that is your, like, there's benefits of being in numbers. And so you get your supporters, and so when the volleys of arsenal comes at you, that you're protected, right? Or at least, if you get hit, you can go to your friends and say, I need some support here.
Yeah.
But if you're by yourself, you can't make it. You'll never get I don't think you'll get your idea out there. And so yeah, so persistence, and don't let them tell you that you're not good, right? That your ideas are bad. Like, don't let them tell you that. Stick with your convictions, and also continue your excellent work, right? Continue to find out more and more and build your story until you've got this, and keep your voice out there and keep your support system out there. And then, in time, if you're persistent, you keep going, then, because we are complex systems, really, we're built to suddenly change. So if you keep push, it can change. And actually, I was listening to Rachel Maddow last night, one of my favorite commentators, and she was talking to Bill McKibben, and Bill McKibben was talking about how, is it like the big oil companies, they've said, like, the Dutch suddenly have ruled that I forget which oil company it is, but it doesn't matter.
Royal Dutch
Like, there's so
Shell.
many big ones. Yeah, Shell,
Mhm.
and there's Exxon, those great big Standard Oil, that suddenly there's been like 3 huge court rulings that say these countries have to reduce their emissions by 45% to 20 by 2030. And suddenly that puts a huge amount of pressure on these big oil companies, and it's a tipping point in the right
Yeah.
direction, right? It's Bill McKibben, Naomi Klein, Rachel Maddow, all the people working hard, all of us who are working for the environment, you guys, me, suddenly there's a shift, and it's a shift in a positive direction. And if you give up, we'll never get to that shift. But the shifts do happen because that's how systems work. It's like you push, the relationships start to change in a little bit, and suddenly you get a big change. And those can be big positive tipping points. They can also be terrible tipping points
Yeah.
going the other way. But what we want it to be is a tipping point in the right direction. And I feel like we are kind of, with Joe Biden in there, making his, pushing to decarbonize, which is going to meet a bunch of resistance, I'm sure, but he's going to have to keep pushing, getting people behind me, slowly convincing the people that this is the way to go. And these decisions, each one of them, add to it to build up to something really positive. And if you give up in your work early on because somebody, you got offended, or it was hard, don't give up, right? Just speak your truth and keep going. That's my advice.
We've been offended so many times. I don't even know what it's like to be offended anymore. I don't even know what's left of me.
Yeah, you kind of
know?
just brush it away.
Yeah. Oh, that was interesting. That was like a gnat coming by, just swat it.
But when you're young, it doesn't feel like a gnat. It feels like you've been hit by an elephant,
It's funny, and
It's truly an elephant.
it's truly an elephant. Yeah. Perspective's so interesting. So for the people that are championing your work like yourself, who are the ones that you find are really leading the torch with these efforts, maybe not for profits or anybody of that sort, that are really, really making sense and taking action upon what needs to be acted upon?
Yeah. Who are they? Well, let's just talk about the value of those people
Please.
first. And
Yeah.
I'm going to make an analogy with the forest. So, what I found in my research in mapping what these mycorrhizal networks look like below ground, I discovered that, we discovered, my graduate students, my colleagues, and I, it was a bunch of us working together. Everything that's good takes teamwork.
Right.
Um, we made a map of what the network looks like in the forest, and we found that the big old trees are the centers. They're the hubs of the network. They are highly connected to everything else. They transmit all kinds of information and resources throughout the forest. They're like the matriarchs of the forest, and every society has got leaders like that, right? It doesn't mean that the other people aren't important. They are extremely important. All the trees are important, and there's a dynamic going on all the time. There's a leader, and then maybe it'll die back, and then another one, a leader rises up, but there's always this shifting, and then there's the followers, and they might become leaders. So it's a dynamic system, whether you're in a social system or a forest system. But those leaders are super important. So Bill McKibben, for example, Naomi Klein, they're important thought leaders. James Hansen was an important thought leader. You know, Lynn Margulis was an important thought leader in understanding that symbiosis or endosymbiosis was an important part of evolution. Charles Darwin was an important thought leader. So we got to find those people, and and they lead us, right? And so who are they? Who are the ones that are driving things right now? Well, I mean, we're all playing an important role. I have to emphasize it's important to have small action all the way up to big action.
Right.
And the small actions are just as important. That's the grassroots movements. That's YouTube. That's viral. That's how things go viral, is like hearts and minds. That's important. But then you need this leadership part too. Who's going to drive the way? Well, if you're lucky, you've got a good leader. Like, I think Joe Biden is a good leader. I think um, that's my own feeling, but you had a terrible leader before, right, who was driving things the other way. So when you get a good one, then invest in them the power to do good work.
Right.
And in the environmental movement, I would say, like, the NGOs are hugely important right now. um, and uh, and I think that they're going to supersede at some point. The people are going to invest their power more in the NGOs, the green parties, because we see our lives are on the line, right? Or we're going to force the more status quo democratic governments into serving the people more, and so they can take over that thought leadership position from the NGOs and at some point. But they've got to be able to do their job and serve their creds and build good policy. But if they don't, then people will start moving over to other thought leaders, and we have great leaders in this world, and it's important to let them lead us, or to get their thoughts out, so that we're informed, we're educated, that we have science-based approaches to things instead of emotional and ill-informed approaches. So I don't know if I haven't answered your question completely directly. I think the media plays a hugely important part as well. I see that in the launching of my book, right? My book would have been ignored again
Yeah.
if I didn't have the media and the publicity team behind me driving this. It was every step, every piece, every person is extremely important in making this message get out. So so we need to make sure that we have these networks in place to support if there is a great thought coming out. Like, I think this book is one example. There's lots. Rachel Maddow's book Blowout, another great example. Stacey Abrams, other there's amazing examples out there. But we need to support them and let them filter up to people's consciousness. And so media plays a hugely important role in doing that as well.
filter up to the consciousness. It's like send the sugars out and I'm going to pull the water right back up to where I need, right? What eh, just to kind of cap this off, I'm talking about tree cover here. What does utopia look like for the forest? And what does utopia look like for us as human beings in relation to that nature?
Well, I think a key word is balance, right? I mean, we live in a biosphere that is a self-reinforcing biosphere. James Lovelock wrote about this beautifully in his and Glenn Margulis, the Gaia theory. Um, and that Gaia theory has been in our consciousness, in our cultures for since the beginning of time. I mean, they came up with the word Gaia, which is like I don't know if that's a Greek name or,
It's the
but
name of my dog.
those is it? Oh,
Yeah.
that's cool. In the Coast Salish, they call it
Yep.
Netsamast, which means we are one. And there's a word in every language for we are all in this together. And we make our own world, our own healthy world. So in a forest, it's about balance. And that means, the ability to photosynthesis. I can't emphasize enough. Photosynthesis is what drives our lives. It's that highly evolved, beautiful, intricate machinery that has allowed us to have oxygen on our earth and clean water and allowed human beings and our dogs and cats to evolve, right? So we have to protect that very basic thing. And the forest then is going to be in balance. And so high photosynthetic capacity. That means, carrying capacity of native plants and trees. And if you create holes in it by clear cutting it, life will fill in, but it's not, if you do it in a sloppy way, like getting rid of the forest floor, taking out all the mother trees, disrupting the hydrology, then a bunch of weeds are going to move in and it's out of balance. So we need to make sure when we're managing ecosystems that we leave enough behind, enough of the wisdom from the past, the genes, the seeds, the coarse woody debris, the forest floor, the soil, that it's all left there to rebuild the forest, because the forest is always going to be wanting to renew itself. And also with that is the natural disturbance cycles. We need to let those carry out their imprint on the ecosystem. Our forests in North America are by and large fire regenerated forests. Well, we've disrupted that whole cycle, right? We suppress fire, fuels built up. We've got climate change, lots of heat. So we're getting these big mega fires out of balance. So we need to sort of, in order to help our forests get back into balance, we need to allow these natural disturbances to carry out their good jobs of renewing the forest. But, we also have to be part of this, right? We can't just let nature take its course, because there's lots of us here now, and we've created this climate change that's going so fast that trees can't adapt as quickly. And so we have an important role. It's our obligation to help these ecosystems, recover and to sort of control these natural disturbances so that it's, we don't create mega fire disasters. It's got to be done very carefully. It's got to be science
Yeah.
based. It's got to be knowledge
So
based.
then
Wise. It's got to be wise.
this will be my last question / comment. You are not perfect. I am not perfect. Jason's not perfect. None of our listeners are perfect. There are points in our lives where the data stares us in the face, but we choose to ignore it. And I'm sure this has happened with you. What afforded you the self-awareness to look at the data for what it was and start to act intelligently with wisdom upon it? I know there were many times where you just ignore, and it's screaming at you in the face. How did you build that self-awareness to be like, oh, this is the key? This will open up that pathway, that door for me. What was that for you?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Like, I always call myself a survivalist, right? Like I just needed to survive in this system. So I was very focused on just, keeping my job, being able to do my work, that I always loved my work, right? Driven by, my love for the forest and knowing how essential it was. So that was with me the entire time. Um, I'm fortunate that I grew up in these forests. I could see what they're supposed to look like and what we were doing with them. So I had that drive. But then, and I was watching our forest did be disconnected. A forest is a place of connection and relationships, and what we're doing is disconnecting them and throwing away the relationships or minimizing them till they're simplified and don't work anymore. And I was struggling with this. What is it that we don't get? I knew what we didn't get, but why aren't people listening? And what is it that we're missing? What can I tell people? And I started working with the Aboriginal people of British Columbia, and I got a postdoc, Dr. Teresa Ryan, who started, and I started working with a number of Indigenous people, and they taught me about connection. That, I mean, I understood it, but then they just said, this is our worldview. It is about connection, and I'm going, that's it. That's what the forest managers, the economists, the politicians, they're missing that part. And then I'm like, okay, this is it. This is the main message. And so once I could get that in my mind, as a white person came from a colonist family, who settled in Western Canada, who struggled, who grew up in the forest and knew that things were not going well, and trying to articulate this, and finally she just said, oh, it's about connection, it's about balance, we're all in this together, we're one. And I'm like, that's it. And so then I started saying, I've got to tell people, or I've got to tell all my white folks who don't get
Tell the
this,
white friends who
that
can't
this is
figure it out. You know what I mean?
no.
You damn
I
white
mean, it
timbers,
sounds,
get it straight.
well, it's so frustrating that we have ignored and ridiculed that Indigenous knowledge for so long, and yet that is the key, right? And so, okay, now we know it's the key. So let's go. We don't take the knowledge from them, we learn from it, right? And develop an even broader knowledge, bring together Western science, Indigenous science, through respect and cooperation, because we're all in this together, right? We all want our children to live to the next generation and so on.
Right.
So we can come together and create something beautiful and wise.
Thank you very much for sticking your neck out there above the tree line amongst the buzzsaws, going up against people that are, very profit driven and frankly could care less. What you're doing is not easy. And I'm sure there have been times when it's been immensely frustrating, which you have never shared, and, emotionally turmoil inside. But I think that has helped refine your story, uh, the power behind that story, and looking for the things where you can really find that connection point amongst others. So you are that walking network of wisdom. Thank you for putting it in this book. Thank you for sharing it on here. Thank you for putting up with us. And thank you for asking, asking good questions and telling us fantastic answers to at the same time. Suzanne, um, is there anything else you want to leave us with other than all these phenomenal mic drops you've left already?
I would say I do have one last message is, there are kids out there putting their lives on the line, whether they're in Amazon or on Fairy Creek on Vancouver Island, or probably in the taiga of Russia. We just don't see them putting their lives on the line to change the trajectory that we're on. They're basically, chaining themselves to trees and saying, this is our lives you're screwing around with. We need to support them. And we need to all be in there saying this stuff. So I think that's my final message. I support, I support this. We're here. We're here for you, and we're all in this together. We're all, it's all of us together making these changes happen. So yeah,
That's amazing.
that's my final. And thank you so much. Those were awesome questions and great conversation.
Well, hopefully, that's what we're here for. Just trying to learn, right? So it's
Yes,
I don't know. I'm just straight shook. Maybe you can take me a walk through the woods sometimes. Does that sound good if I ever make it up to BC?
I would love to.
All right.
Yeah,
Well, listen, my
I'll come
friend,
down.
we will be in touch. Thank you again.